Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, ko Derek Wenmoth tōku ingoa. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon, really. It seems that the turbulent times we're in call for kind of massive change in mindset, and that's something that this group, I know, has been really focused on pursuing and working with. So today I thought I would take the opportunity to kind of engage you a little in a conversation more than just listening to me. So we're going to do a couple of little sessions breaking out and chatting to each other, and hopefully we'll be able to see what's happening here in a second. Why has that gone break on me? So we, as the title says, it's about hearing stories rather than a sort of a webinar or a lecture or something. But I just want to start really by inviting you to focus your minds on your own context. There was a little bit of a chat as we started about the situation we're in, some with doing lots of Zoom calls, others working with students in their classes, fine weather, bad weather, all this sort of stuff. It all contributes to the context that we're in, the situation we're in. And often it can distract us a little bit from looking a bit further down the track. And so today is about that, looking further down the track and what we can change. And so in a moment, I'm going to just put you into some groups just to brainstorm some sort of ideas, small groups, about kind of what are some of the challenges that you're facing right now. Just a snapshot. We're going to use those to riff off. But just before we do, I wanted to, I guess, draw attention to this illustration that's on the screen at the moment. And depending what size screen you're working on, you may or may not be able to read it. But it was from an OECD document that came out before COVID, but it was a part of their work on looking at the future of education. And one of the things in that paper was the fact that we are facing with more regularity now and more consistency almost, or persistency perhaps, a range of things that are causing us at times to rethink how we provide a quality education to our learners when they're no longer able to attend that physical place called school. And you'll see the little list that's on the screen there, which they explore a little more, looking at things like natural disasters, plagues, and COVID and so forth don't feature on there yet, but I'm sure they would in future ones. But it goes right down to thinking about, even the economic shock and crisis and war, which we're now experiencing in other parts of the world, but the downstream impact is affecting us as well. And so it's a reminder that whilst we've got a short-term and immediate context to look at here, there are some longer-term things that the challenges that we're facing right now are likely to return again. And so it's up to us to think, what can we do? So there's a Notely, which is going to go into the chat, or if you're quick enough, you can copy it from there. And as soon as I've finished my prattle, you're going to be put into some groups. It's just a big board. Pick up a new note off the side of it. So there's a slide here that quickly shows you how to do that. There's just a little plus sign. That's what it'll look like. Click a note, and in your groups, just have a conversation, as I say, focused around what those challenges are. Don't be too quick to write. You're going to have a reasonable amount of time to discuss, but see if you can summarize in 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it takes slides then, or notes on the board, those things that are kind of perplexing you, they're challenges that are kind of preventing or stopping or causing you to think of new ways to do what you do.
Yeah, so Derek, I see somebody like Rhonda's popped up, just said exhaustion level. So what do you think causes this exhaustion at this during this time?
Look, there are no surprises up here, as you say, and I think I've been talking with so many teachers and schools in the last few weeks that it's a common thing, the exhaustion. I mean, even I'm feeling it, to be honest. And I guess there are many causes, but I can say, for one thing, that I've experienced with some schools that I'm working with, one in particular that actually thought ahead and had a lot of these things in preparation started planning this, towards the end of last year or earlier. And another one that has for a long time operated in an environment with blended learning, kids with laptops, a lot of stuff online and this sort of thing. In both of those situations, the stress level is significantly less than a couple of other schools that have only just started to climb on this, who didn't have that. So I think one factor is certainly preparedness and looking ahead, which is, I guess, part of what I'm looking at. But then over and above that, there's enormous amount of stuff. There's extra workload just associated with getting things together. There's home and family for people. There's what's happening in the broader community. Often schools become the hubs for trying to coordinate and take responsibility. So no easy answer there, I don't think, Caroline, but just an acknowledgement that this is why that broader issue of well-being and understanding the link between well-being and our performance as educators and what we do in schools is so important.
I also think for some of the leaders that I've been working with, they've talked about preparing plans based on the advice that they're getting, and before they've even had a chance to implement them, there's been more plans, more changes. So it's almost like you make plans, they're not used, and then you're thrown into making more plans.
Yeah, I think it highlights for me why it's so important that schools just take ownership of what they're doing, and the advice and the guidance and what comes in, assimilate that in, but stick to your knitting, stick to the plans you make.
Yeah. And I think also just looking at some of the other comments that have come up, just how important it is. It's actually about whānau, it's actually about people first, and then the mahi second.
Yeah, I guess what I keep coming back to, because I had the opportunity to research and read all of the papers that came out in 2020 after the first lockdown, and they are now they're available on the FutureMakers website, and the ministry have now published part of that as of yesterday, actually, so it only took them a year. But I think it's really important to understand that there are a lot of lessons learned that have been documented, that have pulled together some pretty clear understandings of what worked, what didn't, and where the stresses and pressures were for people, and the sorts of things that we can do to perhaps better prepare ourselves and our aokonga and our communities for the future.
Yeah. So I remember downloading your, sort of like almost in my head, it's your first paper, which was on the resilience planning for schools last December.
Oh, yeah.
And I also remember doing a quick skim of it, but nothing more, because I think the lure of the holidays just got in the way of actually engaging with that, which actually signposted what we were going to be facing in early 2022. So just before I hand back to you for the next bit of the content, I just want to thank you for doing the thinking for us before most of us even knew that we needed to do this type of thinking. So your first paper led to the second, which was all about hybrid learning. And I promise that paper I not only read many times, but I used it with schools as we spent much of the teacher-only days in January planning for what was to come. So can you talk with us now about the hybrid learning framework and how it's being used by schools?
Yeah, so maybe just, thanks, Caroline, a little background. I was motivated to write that and put it out after working with Otaki College last year. I've been working with them for about 2 years now, looking at deep learning through the NPDL program and a lot of transformation change. And they're just, it's a wonderful school to work with. And it's wonderful because it's not the typical easy to make change in type school. Otaki is a district that's got significant challenges that are kind of reflective of broader New Zealand society in a lot of ways. But the school is a magical place with great leadership and some excellent staff. So it's been good working there. But towards the end of last year, the principal asked me, just as a passing comment, he says, I've been thinking about what we've just come through and looking ahead to next year. Things could be a bit rough for us, couldn't it? If we have this peak that's coming as it was being looked. This was about November, so not a lot of people were really looking at it particularly, but he was. And I had a conversation with him because I'd been looking at this quite in depth and following the trends and the information coming out from health and so forth, and thinking we really are going to be facing something quite significant. And I've been talking particularly inside the Ministry of Education, to try and say, we need some support coming out here, guys. But the ministry in many ways were a bit like so many schools, where the end of the year was coming and it was kind of, if we can get to there, we can have a break and we'll rest. And that's being human, right? But in Otaki, the principal and his team decided that after speaking with me, and I had a day working with them, that they would be prepared to be, I put them a challenge really. I said, how courageous are you? Would you like to go whole hog on this and become fully hybrid? I'd outline my thinking in its early stages there, or are we just going to incrementally do some stuff? And they said, look, let's go the whole hog, based on the fact that I had the confidence of staff and had been there for a couple of years and so forth. So we began right then preparing what it might look like to run a whole school, a secondary school, as a hybrid organisation. And we mapped out the scenarios, we looked at everything that might happen and the mitigations we might put in place. And last week I rang the principal there and said, how's it going? He said, well, we've got X staff out and we've had students out and we've got, he wasn't immune to it. But when I asked him, how are you getting on? He said, well, it's bringing extra pressure, but we've just stuck to the plan. As the scenarios eventuate, we've got that solution. We're just putting that into place. And the mood was not, I wouldn't say relaxed, but the mood was, we've got this. And I've been working with them remotely, and it's certainly what I'm picking up from the staff. So I guess what I'm about to share you, the framework, was really my articulation of the journey that we'd taken with Otaki, and putting it into a form that others might be able to learn from. And so it starts really here, where I've just thought of fancy names and labels. Gosh, you'll be able to think of that. But I call it a learning conditions audit. And really it says, what's behind that is saying, how well do we understand the conditions that our learners are in, and our teachers, when it comes to their teaching and learning, particularly when they're not at school, okay? But actually we could well do a learning conditions audit in our school as well and understand better the quality of the learning environments and the opportunities we're creating there. This is based on the fact that in that research that we did, that I did during COVID, the gap between the knowledge of educators and schools and about their students when they're at school and what it's like at home was one of the most significant issues that came up. So there's some advice in my paper, but it's basically just a survey, questionnaire, community engagement, ringing up, whatever the process might be, to actually gather much deeper and more significant insights so that you actually understand what the learning conditions are and the teaching conditions, and you're not working on assumptions that might just apply in a few cases. The next thing then was this idea of establishing the school online. And that sounds a pretty easy thing to do, but basically what we're talking about there is all of that stuff that just happens on a day-to-day basis. What does it look like if we shift that, our planning, our organization, our communications? What happens if we could plan for the future where all of that actually is online, not because we're going to do everything online per se, but it becomes the galvanizing point. So whether we're in school and on site or remote, that's our common reference point. And so in thinking about that, I've put in one of my papers this example, which was built on a business example. This might have been a retail shop. The retail shop's got its online store. In the back is the warehouse, and the customer works with these two places, but actually what's being provided and delivered comes from the warehouse, right? And that's pretty much the way we are thinking in a hybrid environment. There's a whole lot of back-end stuff that the school or kura does. And what I'm suggesting is we need to be thinking about putting a lot of that online so that it can be accessed either physically or virtually, And it creates then the opportunity for learners and teachers to seamlessly move between. Because in the COVID research, the overwhelming response from schools, if you're looking at the percentage of reports that came reporting on what happened, there was an enormous emphasis on well-being, quite appropriately. When it came to support for learning, there was an overwhelming kind of, well, we'll just give them these packs to kind of catch up or practice or rehearse. And again, in an emergency remote situation, that's okay. But if we're facing this in a longer term situation, we need to think about how we create a greater seamlessness. And it's all to do with setting up the back end in an environment that's accessible from anywhere. And so this is just another view of that environment, if you like, which, please excuse these arrows here, they should be both ways, really. But this represents the stuff that happens in that back end, and you'll recognize a whole lot of that sort of thing. These are the things that schools, particularly the frontline staff, the office secretary, they're handling this on an everyday basis, all right? But the teachers and the students aren't particularly interested in all of that per se. They're interested in this stuff here, the experience that they're having as learners, right? And so the challenge is, how can we put all this together in a way that creates a seamless experience for learners and teachers where this is really at the front end? So that's what I mean by establishing the school online. And I'll give you an illustration of what that actually looks like in a second. Because the next thing that we talked about here, and in Otaki School, which is probably like a number of other schools that you may be familiar with, they already had quite a bit of stuff happening online. Most departments had a departmental website. Number of teachers were using Google Classroom because they happened to be a Google school, and it was going. But the issue was that the attention to the instructional design wasn't necessarily there. And so these environments tended on the whole to be places where stuff was stored so that students could access it. And that's okay, but it didn't have any of the kind of instructional paradigm there that actually coached and supported and facilitated students in how they were to make sense of that and what they were to do with it and so forth. And secondly, what was happening in science was quite different from what was happening in social science and was different again from English. And so from a student experience perspective, there was no coherence. They had to get used to completely different interfaces and navigation to find their way into things. And so one way around that we used at Otaki was to think about how we could collaborate a lot more and bring coherence to what we're doing. And the mechanism we used for that was just to say, let's agree to use some very basic templates for all of our planning and so forth. And so we did. And it's made a significant difference. There's modifications being made even today, but they're well on the way. And so using that template, that was the template in a sense was a scaffold for getting them on the same page to think about making sure that they had everything covered. And secondly, we put into the template then little prompts to make sure that what they were doing was aligning not only with what their curriculum needed to do and said they should be doing, but also with the school's values and with the learner qualities that they had identified as a school that they wanted their graduates to come out with. So quite a powerful shift in the way that things were happening. Then we started to design the learning. This is the online thing. And a little piece there that I expand a lot more in the document, but is making sure that in that design, and this is covered in the template, there's a balance between what we present as learning content and then what we give as a learning activity, and then how we represent the assessment, all of which needs to be transparent for the learner, for the parents and whānau, and for other teachers, so that in times like we've got now, where teachers may have to cover for each other, it's all there. So in this example, this is an example of the sort of direction that they are heading at Otaki using their Google classroom, and this is Hapara's sort of dashboard thing. But so they're setting things up so their students can see what the instructions are, what the learning is, and in here there's a little bit of an embedded video that means the students can go back and listen to the instructions, whether they're on campus or remote, because so many times the teachers are finding that even in classrooms, students are saying, what do we have to do again? They can say, it's all there, go and look at it, rewind it, right? Then in this column here, we were looking at the learning content, the things that they needed to do and know about, and some what set them up. In this case, for a project we called Time Machine, where they were actually building and creating their own clocks. And so there was a whole research thing about the history of clocks and what time telling looked like in other cultures, and particularly how Maori told the time before we had Europeans. Then over here was a whole lot of instruction on how to create their clock and how to capture the story of it, which over here had a link off to the rubric that demonstrated or showed how they were going to be assessed through that process. And so you can see end to end, there is a transparency to the whole process. The students have access to what they need, and so do parents and whānau if they want to, and as I say, other teachers if they have to come in and cover. So that's the planning, and I'm design of learning, not going to get hugely into any of these things because each of them could be its own webinar, I'm telling you, right? And then the final couple of things then are around monitoring progress and achievement. And this really is around what is the new role for teachers in here? What is it that teachers do that encourage that activity of learning and so forth, before finally, the whole thing becomes a review and refine cycle where you're going around for the next thing. And at the center of all of that is professional development, because somehow we've got to bring teachers on board. And the very latest paper that I put up about codifying teachers' practice is a part of my approach to that I thought I'd put out there and share. And it may or may not suit everyone. Certainly some have picked it up and doing quite a bit of work with it. So that's the big picture there. Now, the next thing I just want to share with you as leaders, because if you're thinking about that process in your school, Otaki was the school that I was mentioning, who have put all of that in place, and where their teachers are feeling a little more confident that they've actually got a structure in place and an approach and a methodology to get them through. So that's one thing to take on board as leaders. And of course, the learning conditions audit is a really essential part for addressing some of those concerns about well-being, because that, without a doubt, will come out of that sort of thing. Now, the second thing then is, so how do you communicate conceptually some of this? And this is sharing this really with you as leaders, because it's not necessarily the sort of thing that teachers have got the mental space at the model at the moment for coming in. But just want to share with you this as a framework, not to get into any depth with, but just to understand. This is some work I'm doing with the ministry at the moment, and it's unlikely ever to look exactly like this, but we're starting here to say, so what would happen if we represent somehow the framework so that people who are looking for assistance and are looking for support can click on some of these things and go deeper and deeper and deeper. And of course, with any scaled framework like this, it's pretty high level here until you click on the next one and say, so you think, what's the difference between learning tools and learning services, for example? Well, you could click on that and go a step further. Okay, so, but I want to point out, you see, it's the relationship between the on-site and remote learning environments that are quite distinct and quite discrete, and that connected learning environment, the online environment, the place where the materials and the content and the instruction and the support and the mechanisms for connecting are all based. Which leads me to, I thought I had one more, but that's all right. It leads me to then where I'd like to come to for here, if we reflect on what I've just shared with you, and I know I've gone over it relatively quickly, but that's for two reasons. One, you can read a lot about it in the papers. Two, this is going to be recorded. You can go back and look at it. And anyway, we wanted to create the time for the conversation you're going to have now. But three is because there's such depth in all of this that it's probably, there are lots of people on this call that you could go and talk to, or myself, to get some support to burrow down. But the challenge I'd like to send you back into some groups right now is just based even on that broad overview. Some of you may have read the material and have a lot of ideas, others might be new, but there are some quite specific steps that I introduced you to back in that diagram there, right? That you might look and say, okay, I look at that. Now, what's something as a takeaway from here that I might want to take action on? Is it something that you can actually do? Is it something that you might want to go and seek some help about? Is it something you want to go and read more to get greater clarity? But we want to encourage you to think about it from a leadership perspective. So there's bound to be a personal perspective here, something you need and want. But ultimately, it's what are you going to do in your context as a leader to provide leadership, to provide guidance, to provide support for those who are part of your network that you're leading. Just going to whip through some of these in a really summary way. And if you've got extra comments or extra things you think about, please use the chat now, or keep adding to the Jamboard. The link for this will go out afterwards. What it would be my hope is that you would actually take some personal responsibility to come back here and look at these statements. And if there's any that you've put out there, kind of hold yourself to account for this. And that might mean going back to people at Leadership Lab, or coming to me, or whoever you want, to get a bit of help and guidance, or connect with someone else that's on the call. But if I look at the one that's on the board here, group 6, it's got that delicious kind of mix of what can I do right now, right through to this one, how do we make it sustainable? And I just love seeing that statement there, because it's not always the thing that's front of mind for people. So I think that when I look at here and I see these two, for example, increasing collaborative practice, I couldn't urge and encourage you more to consider in your schools how you might break down some of the silos and the separations to become more collaborative. It's been very interesting, for instance, with Otaki. It was not part of what we set out to do deliberately or intentionally or explicitly, but it was always in the back of our minds, we hoped it would. But what happened quite naturally, we've started to see some cross-curricular connections being made because of the transparency in the planning, and departments saying, oh, actually, we could pick that up and reinforce that in our area. So that's an encouragement to an eternal optimist like me, to think that if we persist with a system and a structure and a framework, we might see these things develop. If I look at this next one here, we were talking before, this is the one, there's a lot on here, but this one here becomes really important, I think. We can't underestimate the importance of actually reconceptualizing what it means to work with parents and whānau as partners in the learning relationship, not just as the people who look after the kids and we get them to tick off the spelling list or whatever, or certainly by secondary school. Often that sort of relationship is dissipated altogether, and the kids don't want their parents to see their work. But in a hybrid environment, with the level of transparency we can achieve, there's real benefit in that. So pick that one off here. The next, only a couple more to go. This one stood out with the upskilling staff, early adopters, staff needs. There was obviously a real conversation here about staff professional development, which is the centerpiece of that diagram. And I've got a whole heap of material that I could share with anyone who's interested around how we think about taking people forward with us. That's for another day. And then, but I'm just conscious of the time, need to leave it. The last one that was that I'll look at here, coming here also picked up this stuff from PD, but I was intrigued by this one here, which is a really good thing, you know, for teachers to start asking questions about the things that deeply concern us in education now, like inclusion and the universal design for learning frameworks, like the implication for neurodiverse learners. Because my point there is so many questions are being asked. Oh, but is working in an online environment, how's it going to impact kids who have these particular needs, or this kind of link to their neurological kind of settings? Often we ask those questions assuming that those kids or others are adequately catered for in our face-to-face settings. And I think what this does is it highlights the need for us to be asking those sorts of questions about both settings, and understanding that in our design, and that's where the UDL frameworks and others become really useful, in our design, we've got to set on some approaches that are going to ensure that every child's needs are met in every setting.